My name is Vito O'Orazio. I'm an associate professor of political science at UT Dallas. Today I'll present Understanding the Conflict in Afghanistan. To understand the conflict in Afghanistan today, we're going to break the history up into three time periods: 1978 to 2001, 2002 to 2014, and 2015 to 2020. In the first time period, we'll look at Afghanistan's three civil wars and provide some background on where the Taliban came from. In the second, we'll look at the US and NATO policy towards Afghanistan and why the Taliban was able to regroup. In the third, we'll look at the ongoing conflict and discuss one reason the Taliban were able to win so quickly after or during the US withdrawal. Finally, I'll provide some thoughts and raise some questions on the current situation in Afghanistan. From 1978 to 2001, there are actually three civil wars in Afghanistan. The first, from 78 to 92, was between the Soviet-backed PDPA and the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were not a single unified force. Rather, they were a collection of armed groups who were united by their opposition to the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. This civil war was gruesome, left an estimated 1.24 million dead, created 2 million internally displaced people and 6 million refugees, many of whom ended up across the border in Pakistan. Many of these refugees in Pakistan would join the Taliban in the 90s. The Soviet Union withdrew in 1989 and would continue to support the government in Afghanistan until its collapse in 1991. The future Taliban were part of the Mujahideen insurgency against the Soviets. However, when this war ended, Mullah Omar, who would lead the Taliban, and others simply went home. They were not part of the early stages of the Second Civil War, which lasted from 92 to 96. While the First Civil War was fought outside of Kabul, the capital city in Afghanistan, the Second Civil War would destroy Kabul. This war was not as disastrous as the first in terms of fatalities, but Afghanistan would become a failed state with no stable government. From this environment, the Taliban formed in 1994 and would organize around three main goals. One, end the civil war and bring stability. Two, enforce Sharia law. Three, make Afghanistan into an Islamic state. These goals, of course, aren't mutually exclusive, but rather mutually reinforcing. Sharia law and a religious state is how the Taliban planned to stabilize the country, and they did so relatively quickly. They captured Kabul in 1996, bringing an end to the Second Civil War and a start to the Third, where the Taliban would fight the Northern Alliance for control of the remaining contested regions in the north. The only states to recognize the Taliban were Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, so they lacked international legitimacy, but they were the de facto government, and once in power, the Taliban were extremely repressive, particularly against women and minority groups such as the Hazara, who are Shia Muslim. They also provided safe haven for al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who returned to Afghanistan in 1996, just before the Taliban took Kabul. With safe haven in Afghanistan, bin Laden and al-Qaeda would launch three major attacks against Western targets: the embassy bombings in East Africa in 1998, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000, and the 9/11 attacks. Following 9/11, the US demanded the Taliban hand over bin Laden. They refused. The US partnered with the Northern Alliance and began airstrikes against the Taliban in October 2001. By the end of 2001, the US had taken Kabul and all major cities, ending the Third Civil War and Taliban rule. Following the removal of the Taliban from power, the question was, now what? What would be US policy towards Afghanistan? This plot begins to answer that question and is a key part to understanding why the Taliban regrouped and formed an insurgency against the US and the new Afghan government. The plot shows foreign troop deployments to Afghanistan in 2002 to 2014. On the x-axis is the year, and on the y-axis is the number of troops deployed. The solid line represents international peacekeepers and the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force. The dashed line represents deployments under Operation Enduring Freedom, which is primarily American troop deployments. In the early years of the war, and while Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense, these two operations were distinct and had different missions. The focus of Operation Enduring Freedom was counterterrorism, in short, to kill or capture al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The focus of ISAF, in contrast, was counterinsurgency and peacekeeping. These two operations really represent two competing policy approaches to Afghanistan. The Bush administration, and Rumsfeld in particular, favored the OEF counterterrorism approach. Additionally, they did not want the US to be seen as an occupying force like the Soviets were, because they were concerned about an anti-US insurgency. so troop numbers were kept low. U.S. policy toward the Taliban was to hunt them down for their role in supporting al-Qaeda and to prevent them from returning to government. The U.S. also supported and worked with Afghans who led operations against the Taliban but who were repressive and unpopular locally. As a result, many members of the Taliban fled to Pakistan. Generally speaking, Pakistan cooperated with the U.S. against al-Qaeda, but not against the Taliban. So, in Pakistan and remote border regions, the Taliban were able to regroup. In their 2021 article, Bacon and Byman referred to U.S. policies towards the Taliban in the early 2000s as a critical juncture that ultimately laid the foundation for the insurgency to reemerge. In hindsight, it seems the Bush administration got it wrong by refusing to deal with any elements of the Taliban, even the more moderate ones who perhaps didn't agree with harboring al-Qaeda. You could argue that the one thing they got right, by keeping deployments low, was that they avoided the appearance of an occupation. But then the Obama administration went and took care of that. Under Obama, American troops in Afghanistan increased by 70,000 or so. In particular, ISAF deployments expanded and there was an integration of ISAF and OEF operations. These data on deployments are from the Brookings Afghanistan Index, and 2011 is the last year where they reported OEF and ISAF data separately. After 2012, we can see deployments begin to decrease, but not because the US and NATO won. Rather, the plan was to train the Afghan National Security Forces and put them in control. The US would play a more supporting role, although some counterterrorism would continue. This brings us to the third period, 2015 to 2021. Over this period, foreign deployments were low and generally decreasing. The US was supporting the Afghan National Security Forces who were fighting the Taliban insurgency and trying to provide security. And this was not a small conflict. I think that the degree of violence and disruption was larger than many realize. According to the Brookings data, from 2015 to 2020, there were over 52,000 ANSF fatalities and over 17,000 civilian fatalities. In 2019, there were nearly 3 million internally displaced persons. This instability led a lot of Afghans to question who was the stronger side in this conflict, the Taliban or the US-backed ANSF. Jump to summer 2021, and the US is completing its withdrawal. The Taliban begin to win and take control of the entire country extraordinarily fast. Why? How were the Taliban able to win so quickly? This is a question that will be studied for a long time. One explanation, and it's really just speculation since these events are very recent, is rooted in this uncertainty about who the stronger side is and the Afghan fighters' propensity to defect. While the US was there to support the ANSF, they continued to fight because it was not clear who the stronger side was. For many fighters and politicians alike, this uncertainty was reduced as the Americans left. Afghans rapidly began to believe the Taliban were the stronger side, and whether it was true or not is actually irrelevant because it becomes self-fulfilling as fighters defect and politicians flee. It's interesting. Defections are a feature of conflicts in Afghanistan. Christia and Semple go so far as to call it the Afghan way of war. Filkins documents it during the Third Afghan Civil War in the late 90s with a defection to the Northern Alliance, and Barfield makes a similar point about the end of the First Civil War and the fall of the Soviet-backed regime. Now, this is one explanation for the Taliban's rapid victory, and it's really an incomplete explanation. But there's no denying that the Taliban are in control. Moving forward, with the Taliban in control of Afghanistan and the US withdrawal completed, there are a few issues to watch. One, relationships with terrorist organizations. The Taliban in the 90s provided safe haven to al-Qaeda, despite the fact that the Taliban and al-Qaeda had very different goals. The Taliban were focused on Afghanistan, and al-Qaeda was an anti-Western transnational terrorist organization. While I doubt they'll publicly provide safe haven for al-Qaeda or other extremist groups, we should watch for what kinds of relationships develop and with what kinds of groups. Two, respect for human rights. I think the Taliban have their own worldview, and human rights as we know them in the West and the US aren't much of a factor. But that doesn't mean there aren't forces, both domestic and international, that can moderate the group. For much of Afghanistan, the last 20 years was very different than the 20 years before that. And I think the people will push back against human rights abuses more than they did in the 90s. The third issue is international legitimacy. Some people argue that a lack of international legitimacy pushed the Taliban to be more extreme in the 90s. With that in mind, I think they'll get reasonably widespread international recognition. If not at first, they'll get it eventually. And maybe that will be a moderating force as well. But time will tell.